Our reading this morning is Jonah chapter 2, which is on page 929 of the Blue Church Bibles, and do grab one from the back if you haven't. Jonah chapter 2, page 929. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath me barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought up my life from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them, but I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed. I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord." And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land.
Just before I dive into the passage, pun intended there, talking about Jonah, I just want to take a moment to say a thank you. This is the first chance I've had sort of to get out of the house and look you all in the eye and just say thank you for all of your support over the last 6 months. There have been many of you who've cooked for us, who've looked after our children, sometimes at short notice as I've dived into hospital, and who have stood with us and are standing with us in prayer. So I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to all of you for being our church family and community at this time. So this morning we're carrying on with our series in the book of the Old Testament prophet Jonah. We saw last week how he was tasked by God to deliver a message to the people of Nineveh, to change their shockingly brutal ways before God brought judgment on them, which Jonah refused point blank to do. Instead, he ran in literally the opposite direction and jumped on a boat to try and get away. To no one's surprise, perhaps except Jonah's, that didn't work out so well. God could see full well what Jonah was thinking and what he was up to, and God sent a big storm, which only abated when Jonah confessed to the sailors on the ship that the storm was his fault as he was running away from God. He instructed the sailors to throw him overboard. And if that wasn't enough drama for just one chapter of the Bible, at the end, God sent a big fish to swallow Jonah and rescue him from the sea, where we learned that he stayed for 3 days and for 3 nights. This week, we pick up from that cliffhanger to see what Jonah did while he was hanging out in the fish's belly. And as you've heard, basically this chapter is one reasonably long prayer from Jonah to God while he's inside the fish, which ends with God commanding the fish to return, or vomit, if you prefer the slightly more direct language of the Bible, Jonah onto dry land. So what's been going on between Jonah being swallowed by the fish and him being returned to the land of the living? Well, as we've already seen, the main thing that happened was that Jonah prayed. To be honest, I can see why. He's been thrown into the sea, swallowed by a huge fish. What other option does he have? I doubt he had much Wi-Fi signal down there to get him an Uber to get back home. And it's interesting, isn't it, how quick we can be to pray when everything is falling apart around us and we need some divine help. There's nothing like going through a crisis at the end of our strength to bring us to our knees, and Jonah's no different from us in that way. God has well and truly got his attention now, although it cost Jonah a lot before he would focus. I'm not suggesting for a moment that every crisis we experience is a wake-up call from God in this way. As I'll talk about in detail in a bit, it's a little bit more complicated. But I think sometimes it's what it takes to turn our attention back towards God. As C.S. Lewis once commented, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but shouts in our pain. So what does Jonah pray now that he's finally willing to engage with God? Well, I think it's encouraging that verse 1 tells us he prayed to the Lord his God. Despite Jonah's complete refusal to obey God, God has not cast him away. Jonah is still one of God's people, and God is still his God, despite his failings. Jonah can return to God. Jonah can speak to God, despite everything that Jonah has done. This is grace and mercy from God before Jonah even opens his mouth. When Jonah does speak, in verses 2 to 7, he recognizes both God's role in his circumstances and God's deliverance of him. He acknowledges that God has brought about this situation, but that God also saved him when he cried out to God for help. As we said earlier, I don't think this means that God has deliberately engineered every crisis we face. I think it's fair to say that Jonah really only has himself to blame for this one, which was a direct result of running away from God in the first place, so he is very much bearing the consequences of his actions. That might be our experience at times too, but not always, as we'll talk about in a minute. Bearing this in mind, I think it's interesting what Jonah does not say in his prayer. The most obvious omission is any overt hint that he's sorry for having run away from God in the first place. There's no apology, there's no obvious repentance or regret. In fact, much of his prayer is lifted from the book of the Psalms. It's not even his own words. Jonah talks with some irony in verse 8 about those who turn away from God, who turn away from God's love for them. Presumably he's thinking about people other than himself, people who are less faithful, less good than he is. But Jonah's done exactly the same thing in chapter 1, being faithless to God and turning away from him, which he completely fails to see. So does this mean that Jonah's just paying lip service? He's repeating words he's been taught from Scripture, but without really engaging his heart. Well, in verse 9, Jonah seems to make some sort of commitment to God because he promises to make good what he has vowed, which might suggest a change of heart after all. As you might have seen if you glimpsed into chapter 3, spoiler alert, Jonah does finally seem willing to embark on the task that God has given him and deliver God's message to Nineveh. I think all of this makes Jonah's prayer somewhat enigmatic for us to try to understand. On the one hand, he's recognizing God's work and promising to do what he said he would, but at the same time, he fails to acknowledge his disobedience or his role in bringing about the situation that he's facing. Is Jonah sorry for how he behaved last chapter, or is he mostly looking for an escape from the fish because, understandably, he doesn't like it? I don't think it's clear from this passage which way to go on this one. To be honest, Jonah's prayer in our passage this morning is not one I'd have included in the Bible, because I'm not sure it's an amazing model for us. But again, I think this ambiguity makes Jonah all the more human and relatable. I'm sure we can all identify with his reluctance to admit what he's done wrong, to accept the trouble his choices have caused him. I'm sure we can also identify with wanting God to deliver us from a sticky situation and everything else being really secondary. I'd imagine we can all think of times that we prayed with very mixed motives. Jonah's prayer for help and his attitude behind it are perhaps very human and understandable for us. As I said, that's not to say his prayer is necessarily a model. It's as flawed as the man who prays it, but there's some comfort for us there too, because God hears it and God answers it nevertheless. Despite Jonah's reluctance to accept his mistakes, despite his ambiguous motives, God nevertheless hears what he says and God delivers him. In fact, God delivers him twice, from the sea in chapter 1, and again in this chapter, from being in the belly of the fish. I find it really encouraging and really hopeful that God is so gracious towards us with all of our failings and all of our mixed motives. Like with Jonah in our passage this morning, God is merciful to hear and answer our prayers and to deliver us despite our imperfections. We don't need to pray the perfect prayer from a pure heart in order to get God's attention. I don't know about you, but that's a huge relief for me. Even if we've resisted God's guidance and run from him like Jonah, God is still loving and kind to hear our prayers when we turn back to him. It's wonderful to know that he doesn't give up on us, just like he didn't give up on Jonah. Well, so far this morning, we've been thinking about our response to God and his response to us when we face a difficult situation that's mostly or partly of our own making, like Jonah's. But we've also said we can face a crisis that, as best we can tell, doesn't seem to relate to any decision that we've made or any sin that we've committed. What do we do when we suffer or feel far away from God in those circumstances? Well, that's a massive question. It's not one I could begin to answer this morning. People far cleverer than me have spent a lot longer on it and without a huge amount of success. But I think our study on Jonah can offer two things that I hope might be helpful for us in wrestling with this one. One's very big picture, and the other is a little more personal. So starting with the big picture, we live in a fallen and a broken world. I appreciate that might sound obvious if you just flick on the news or spend more than 5 minutes with another person. But I think it's really important in the piece of context when we're talking about feeling God's absence and suffering in our own lives. And that fallenness, that brokenness in the world, is right at the heart of the book of Jonah. The first thing that happens is that Jonah is commanded by God to speak to the Ninevites because of their behaviour. As Lou told us last week, that behaviour was not impoliteness or a bit of grumpiness before their morning coffee. No, Nineveh was the capital of a large and brutal empire, Assyria. Some of their favourite artwork was the large-scale depiction of the torture, dismembering and decapitation of their enemies. I won't go on too much because it's getting close to lunchtime, but you get a bit of a flavour of what life could be like in Assyria. This is fallenness, this is brokenness on a massive scale, a complete corruption of what God intended for his world and the people that he created. It's not how things should be. It's not how God wants them to be. So God commands Jonah to give the Ninevites a major wake-up call to change their ways, and God is determined to bring judgment on them if they persist. This behaviour can't go unnoticed or unpunished by a just God. And it's this fallen and broken behaviour of the Ninevites that drives the whole story of Jonah. God's call to Jonah to do something about it leads him to flee from God in chapter 1 and lies behind his prayer in our passage this morning. We'll see that it remains a source of massive tension for Jonah as the book continues through chapters 3 and 4. More than that, Jonah's reaction to God's call reveals his own fallenness and his own brokenness. We saw last week he just wasn't interested in helping God to change the Ninevites for the better or to address the atrocities that they committed. Instead, he's driven by his hatred for the Ninevites to run from them and from God. And we saw earlier this morning that Jonah's motives don't get much clearer. Despite God's dramatic intervention in the storm and in the fish, Jonah fails to see or repent of his hatred for these Ninevites and is instead more interested in his own survival. So we see clearly in the book of Jonah how messed up this world is and the people in it, including even those like Jonah, who are supposed to be God's special and chosen people. And I think this gives us an important context in looking at our own struggles when God feels distant or when we suffer. I think it's important because it shows us that the world in which we live is fundamentally broken and fallen because we who inhabit it consistently choose to reject God like the Ninevites and like Jonah. And like them, we find that turning from God has caused some pretty terrible problems for us. As I said earlier, I'm not suggesting that each time we feel distant from God or suffer, it's because of something particular in our lives that we may have done or failed to do. That might be the case, but not always. Instead, I'm suggesting that the weight of our combined and consistent rejection of God as a human race through the millennia has torn and broken something fundamental in the fabric of this world. What God initially created to be very good has been fractured, and into those cracks comes the distance from God and the pain that we experience for no particular reason that we can discern. And for me, that's where I'd put my cancer. I'm not aware that it's a direct result of anything that I may have done or not done, or a judgment from God for a particular sin. I think it's probably just a consequence of living in this fallen and broken world which affects all of us differently at different times. My cancer may be quite an extreme example of that, but I still think that's where I'd put it. I don't blame God for it. I don't feel anger towards him for not looking after me better, although both are very understandable reactions. To be honest, I wonder if it's something of a miracle that I've not experienced more of the brokenness of this world before now, given how fractured it is and how much pain and suffering there can be in it. If you stand in the water, you get wet. And if you live in this world, we'll feel pain and we'll feel distance from God at times. Interestingly, something that our consultant said to me early on got me thinking along these lines. She said that there's been a documented increase in bowel cancer in people in their 40s like me all over the world in the last 10 years. There was apparently no clear reason why this should be, although there was some evidence that it might be connected to how we manage and process our food globally. I hope it's not controversial to suggest that not all of the food chains we benefit from are entirely ethical, and that there are some serious problems in some of the processes used in animal welfare. Like everything else in this world, it's broken to a greater or lesser extent. Now, I've not deliberately set out to harm any animals or take advantage of anyone involved in the food chain, and I've tried to shop ethically where I can. Nevertheless, I am part of this global food chain and part of the problems with it, however indirectly, because of what I buy and eat. It seems that the way in which we as a world manage our food may have global consequences, one of which may be my cancer now and that of others in their 40s. I don't know if this is a further example, perhaps, of how the brokenness inherent in our world can cause us pain as we live in it and are unavoidably subject to its problems as well as its joys. So I hope my first thought might be of some help when we're suffering and feel that God is different. I don't know about you, though, but I'm not sure that I'm always looking for a reasoned explanation for what I might be going through. When we feel distant from God, when we feel pain, I wonder if it's more a matter of our hearts than of our heads. More of an emotional response, a cry from our innermost being, than an intellectual conundrum to be puzzled over. One of the most helpful things I've found for that is an old song by the Christian music artist Rich Mullins. Before he died in 1997, Rich recorded a demo tape, that just shows how old it was, for songs for a new album. One of them was called Hard to Get, and was a really heartfelt, but ultimately hopeful song about how sometimes God and his ways are just plain hard to get. After Rich died, his friends recorded his songs properly as the Jesus record, and you can easily listen to it on Spotify or something similar these days, and I'd really recommend Hard to Get, as the lyrics are fantastic. Well, so is the whole album, and so is everything else Rich has ever written, but that's another talk. I think the bridge in particular is really helpful. Speaking to God, Rich says, "And I know you bore our sorrows, and I know you feel our pain, and I know it would not hurt any less, even if it could be explained. And I know that I am only lashing out at the one who loves me most. I know you bore our sorrows, I know you feel our pain, I know it wouldn't hurt any less, even if it could be explained. I know that I am only lashing out at the one who loves me most." For me, I think Rich touched on something really important there, that when we're in the midst of pain and God feels far away, no tidy explanation of our situation can take away that pain. We find ourselves lashing out at God just because it hurts so much. It's a powerful cry from our hearts, and it's one that God is more than able to bear, even when it's too much for us. Rich also reminds himself and us that even in our darkest moments, God is right there with us, feeling our pain with us, even if to us he feels a long way off. Which leads on to my final and more personal thought. You might be interested to know that Jonah gets a mention in the New Testament from none other than Jesus himself. In an account recorded in both Matthew and Luke, Jesus is asked for a sign to prove he is who he says he is. He replies that none will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus is referring here to his death and resurrection, that he'll be killed and buried, similarly to how Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in a fish. Of course, as we've recently remembered at Easter, Jesus was killed by crucifixion. And it's the cross that I personally find so helpful at this time, for a number of reasons. Perhaps most importantly, it tells us quite simply that God is with us. That's what one of Jesus' names, Emmanuel, means, God with us. And that's what happened so clearly when Jesus came to earth, willingly leaving behind the comfort and the glory of heaven to enter and immerse himself in the brokenness and mess of our world. We don't have a God who's aloof and distant, observing us disinterestedly from the security of his heavenly throne. No, we have a God who deliberately stepped down from heaven into the pain and the brokenness of our world, of our lives, when there's absolutely no obligation on him to do so. More than that, we see on the cross that Jesus was willing to embrace so much pain and so much suffering in order to save us. I'm not sure it's an exaggeration to say that crucifixion may be the most awful way ever devised by humans to kill someone. But that's what Jesus willingly underwent in all of its brutality and agony. So the cross tells me that God is no stranger to our pain and to our suffering, however acute it may be. He's experienced firsthand just how terrible this broken world can be. He's endured the worst it had to offer, up to the point of death. On the cross, I see that God understands the depths of our pain, and more than that, he's experienced its weight too. The cross tells me that God understands my pain, that he understands all this cancer entails, and that he gets just how awful it is. Just briefly, I've had 4 emergency admissions to hospital, including one resulting from a large clot on my lungs, a major operation, months of grueling chemo that's left me unable to work or live anything approaching normally, and we've had to tell our children that the doctors can't cure my cancer. In all of this, I find God's identification with me and with my family in this suffering immensely comforting. Thinking about this since my cancer diagnosis has made me realize one other thing as well, that God willingly chooses to suffer with his world and has done so for thousands of years. I think if we're honest, we try to avoid pain and suffering where we can. It's only sensible. And in the West in the 21st century, we've got quite good at it. Generally, we can enjoy good levels of health, opportunities, and quite a good long average life expectancy. We can put more of the acute pain and suffering in our world to one side without too much expectation that we need to suffer it directly. We can stay informed about suffering elsewhere in the world. We can certainly help with it where we can, but we often do so here from a relatively safe position. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why it's so awful when suffering comes crashing into our lives, because we often expect to be spared the worst of it. I think that's certainly true for me. It's deeply distressing to have that expectation shattered, to be exposed to just something of the full force of this world's brokenness and the pain that comes with it. We might feel we're treated unfairly, that we shouldn't have to endure such things because we should be able to live comfortably, like it seems so many around us do. Not so for God. Ever since his perfect world was broken by sin, he's constantly chosen to step into that pain and suffering that resulted. We see many times in the Bible, from early in the Old Testament to the end of the New, how God just refuses to leave his creation to suffer alone. He identifies with those who are struggling. He rescues the oppressed. He cares for the vulnerable. He associates with the victims. He commands his people to do likewise. I really don't know how God does it, but he constantly embraces the suffering of his world and of the people who live in it. He doesn't stand apart, but he rolls up his sleeves. He gets stuck in to the worst of what's going on. And we saw this in Jonah, where God can't permit the atrocious behavior of the Ninevites to continue. He engages with all the pain and suffering they cause and seeks to end it, ideally by the Ninevites changing their ways. And so he calls Jonah, and so the start of the book kicks off. And in all of this, we see that ultimately God is driven by his great love for each one of us. He simply can't abandon us to the brokenness and pain that we've brought in this world, which it inflicts on us. He can't ignore our suffering. He can't ignore the depths to which it takes us. Instead, because he loves us so much, he fully embraces the world, including the worst it has to offer, and meets us in the midst of our darkest moments. And that, strangely enough, is my testimony about this journey with cancer so far. It's a really, really difficult road, one that sometimes feels impossible to walk. But on this awful journey, I still feel so gently held by God, who's already provided for us in so many amazing ways. I don't know why God's permitted this journey. I don't know why he's not ended it already. I certainly pray that he will. But in the meantime, I'm convinced that he walks it with me, not observing from a distance, but right by my side, even through the valley of the shadow of death. And of everything that's going on, that's perhaps the most incredible thing. So wrapping up, there's one final thing I'd like to mention from what we've been talking about. We've spoken a lot about the brokenness of this world and the pain that we experience in this life as a result, sometimes by our own fault, like Jonah, and sometimes not. We've also thought about how we can nevertheless find God in our suffering and how he walks through it with us. But there's one final thing that we've touched on which I'd like to highlight, God's work to restore all things. We see this in the book of Jonah, where God goes to such lengths to tell the Ninevites to mend their ways and stop all the pain and suffering that they're causing. Spoiler alert for next time, he succeeds. They heed God's message through Jonah. And this is a small example of what God is constantly doing on a much larger scale in his world, working to restore it, working to end the pain and suffering that we now experience in it. What God did on a small scale with the Ninevites, he's also doing on a massive scale throughout his world. He always has been and always will be at work to change the situations that bring us grief and to help those who are affected by them. More than that, following his decisive action on the cross, we know that one day in the future that work will be complete. God will finally restore all things to how he intended them to be. As Revelation 21:4 promises us, he will wipe every tear from our eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Whether I receive healing from this cancer or not, and I pray that I will, is not ultimately decisive. God has me safely in his hands for as long as I live, and safely in his hands in death thereafter. In the meantime, he extends this same invitation to us that he extended to Jonah, to join with him in his work of restoring his world. He's fully embraced the pain and the brokenness of this world, and he has not been overcome by them. Instead, he overcomes them with his awesome love for each and every one of us, even in the midst of our worst suffering. I've known no greater joy, no greater purpose than following God and trying to join with him in this amazing work. It has been, it remains my greatest privilege and the most amazing adventure. So, as I go, can I invite you to come along with us?